Jo Bartosch, feminist and writer for Spiked, The Times, The Telegraph and The Critic, just to name a few. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
Jo, you've written several pieces on the current proposals for a conversion therapy ban. What do you think of the evidence base, and do you think that a conversion therapy ban is needed?
So I think it's an entirely conflicted issue. There is very limited evidence to suggest that it is in any way needed, yet we are seeing similar legislation brought in across the world. This is part of a global push. So legislation has been brought in Canada. A friend of mine from Tasmania got in touch today to say it was happening there. It is happening all over the world at around the same sort of time. Now, the UK government did do some research to find out whether it was needed, and they could only find 51 participants who said that they had been through conversion therapy. And when it comes to trans conversion therapy, 4% said that. Now, the problem is that they had been through it, but the problem is there was no definition given of trans. And nor of conversion therapy. So that might have been a therapist asking, are you really sure that you feel like you're in the wrong body? There was no, that wasn't accounted for in any way, and it was entirely self-reported. So they then commissioned Coventry University to do some research, who couldn't find any evidence within the UK whatsoever. So they based their research upon 3 quite flawed studies from self-reported groups in the US. And again, it was the conclusions they came to were fairly questionable. I think if I might carry on, I think one of the points that needs to be sort of teased out here is that there is a difference between being same-sex attracted, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual, or gender identity. That's to say, a diagnosable feeling of gender dysphoria. So that's a psychological feeling of distress, feeling like you're in the wrong body. And we haven't actually got any evidence to suggest that we each have gender identities that can be misaligned with our bodies. So it is perhaps best thought of as a psychiatric condition, though obviously that's deeply unpopular and a deeply politically incorrect thing to say, but it's a fact. And of course, for some men, particularly middle-aged men, it can be a fetish. Identifying as a woman can be a fetish, and that's a problem, because those people then have their fetish effectively protected under legislation, and doctors or therapists won't be able to say to them, are you sure? Similarly, when it comes to children, we know that a high proportion of those, so around about 70%, who identify as the opposite sex, if they weren't treated and if they weren't medicalized, they would grow up to be same-sex attracted. So that is effectively in itself a form of gay conversion therapy, gender identity. And that's why we've seen the Tavistock close down. And that's why we've seen Dr. Hilary Cass, a leading paediatrician. That's why we're really starting to see some a sort of a sea change in the approach towards treating children in particular who identify as transgender, because their needs are very different from those of adult men.
And to follow on with what you've said there, as a feminist, are you concerned that a conversion therapy ban would enshrine gender ideology in law? And what would the implications be for women and girls?
Yeah, I mean, it would be absolutely devastating. And we have seen a sort of de facto self-identification adopted across civil society. So, for example, groups like Stonewall and other sort of effectively trans lobby groups have told employers that they have to have services and facilities that are based on self-identification. So that's to say that a man who identifies as a woman is allowed to use women's changing rooms, women's toilets, those sorts of things. But it also has really serious ramifications for single-sex services. So I've spoken to numerous women who won't now refer themselves to rape crisis centres because they cannot be guaranteed that when they get help, when they get support, that it will be a women-only group, and that's really important to them. And unfortunately, single-sex groups also tend to be a magnet for those sort of nefarious characters with a fetish who want to break down boundaries, so they will gravitate towards women's single-sex groups. I know another woman I spoke to recently. She's bipolar and she gets regularly sectioned, and she's absolutely terrified of being sectioned because she has a morbid fear of men. And the last time she was sectioned, there was a trans woman on her ward. And when she complained to the nurse, it was written into her hospital notes that she was transphobic. So, there are serious considerations when it comes to sort of eroding women's single sex facilities and services. And when you look at prisons, for example, 95% of the prison population is male. And we know that 98% of those convicted of sexual crimes in particular are male. So clearly, male pattern violence is a thing. Now, that's why single-sex services exist. When you then have men identifying into them, obviously the whole point is nullified, particularly when you consider the motivations of those men who may wish to do so. So if gender identity is written into the statute, which it looks set to be if this legislation goes through, which at the moment is kind of on hiatus, but there were constant attempts to write it into law, and they will use quite emotive topics like conversion therapy, which, as I've explained, isn't really a thing, to get this onto the statute.
And in an article for Spiked, you describe the government plans to ban conversion therapy as kind of little more than virtue signalling. What makes you say that?
There's no evidence at all that it is in any way necessary or needed. And yet, we had MPs standing up and decrying it. They all sort of took their turn sort of being outraged and saying it was abhorrent, without any of them actually looking at the evidence. And we had 250,000, 250,000 people signed a petition to ban it. This has been whipped up, but it's an irrelevance. It is not really a thing, if you like. So part of what groups like Stonewall and Mermaids and all these other sort of trans lobby groups do is that when funding runs out for one group because they've achieved their aims, so for example, Stonewall used to be a gay rights group, and then parity between homosexuals and heterosexuals was achieved. So they had to look for a new cause. And gender identity obviously presented itself, and now they're going further and further down these sort of identity rabbit holes. So we see things like asexual, demisexual, grey sexual. I mean, show me the middle-aged woman who isn't demisexual. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. But, we're seeing these things. So what would that mean in terms of a conversion therapy ban? Well, that might mean that I've got a low sex drive. Oh, well, you go to the doctor about it, and suddenly they decide that they can't advise you or give you any treatment because, it could be, or you might be dangerously promiscuous and it might be harming your mental health, but you can't go to a doctor because you might be, hypersexual, which is now a protected gender identity or protected sexual orientation. So these sorts of rabbit holes that various transphobic groups have put the narrative down mean that if we don't have very clear definitions about what conversion therapy is, where it's happening, if it's happening, and to whom it's happening, we will just have a free-for-all for anybody who feels a bit aggrieved to sue their doctor.
And what would you say to someone who claims that they've had a bad experience in a church and says that new criminal laws are the solution?
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably a point where you and I, and indeed perhaps your viewers may differ, is that I believe that shame has a role in social terms, but I don't think it should be applied to those who are same-sex attracted. I believe that's something that's innate and that shouldn't and can't be changed. But where attempts are made to change somebody's sexual orientation, that there are already existing laws to deal with that. So, I think the idea, perhaps something I should have mentioned earlier, is, I think the idea of conversion therapy brings up memories of things like electric shock treatment and aversion therapy and corrective rape. And these are all terrible, terrible things that happen in some parts of the world and happened in the past, but they're not happening now, which is why I think it's sort of, a confected moral panic. And why legislation already exists to penalise these things. So if somebody is badly advised or badly treated in church, well, there are laws to cover that. So I would advise them to perhaps, go to the police if it's serious enough. But if it's a matter of somebody saying, are you sure you really think you're a boy or a girl? Deal with it.
And do you think that people are open to persuasion on this issue?
Absolutely. So I have been writing on this now for around 7 years. And, And during that time, we have seen multiple new groups spring up. And I'm aware that that my focus is probably quite limited towards feminist communities, towards LGBT communities, but I know that the Christians have been doing brilliant work on this too. And I suspect that you feel as let down by your religious leaders, perhaps as we do by our sort of feminists, the legacy feminist organisations and the legacy gay rights organisations. They are now actively working against us. So I think part of what will help persuade people is perhaps getting out of our silos, things like this, sort of crossing those barriers, because I think this is such an important issue and the threats are so real that we just need to do whatever we can to make change. And I certainly think that we are seeing a pushback led by the UK. I mean, I'm not particularly patriotic, but it has really made me quite proud that it is the UK that is pushing back against gender identity legislation.
Well, Jo, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been lovely.